All right, guys. Welcome to yet another fun and exciting lecture with me, your professor, Professor Keys. Um, at this point, I trust that you have watched that sort of introductory film, which provided a definition or a working definition of what the Enlightenment was. And so I am not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to define that for you because that film is there for you. But we are going to talk about one particular person who was an Enlightenment thinker. He is an early Enlightenment thinker from England, a medical doctor whose name you're probably familiar with, if only because you watched the show Lost. But his name is John Locke. Again, an English medical doctor, philosopher, who lived through a tumultuous period of the English Civil War. And, he is responding to the state of the government. And much of his writing, many of his ways of thinking and seeing things, particularly about the role of the government and its relation to the people, will be adopted by many of our founding fathers. And so I think it's critical to have some understanding of the Enlightenment, and specifically some understanding of who John Locke is. We will also, and there's a film I'm going to have you watch, we will also be looking at the First Great Awakening, which was a religious revival that swept through what was at that time the American colonies. And collectively, these two events, and they're really more than events, they're things that occur over long periods of time, as you can see through the date here. But collectively, these particular things help to set a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding not only the role of government, but the role of the people to the government, the role of the people to make choices for themselves. Okay, and so in order to understand the American Revolution, in order to understand the War of Independence, in order to understand why the colonials responded with the Declaration of Independence, in order to understand what the colonials meant by no taxation without representation, we must begin with an assessment of these two periods of history, because they shaped the way Americans thought. Okay? Before we get started, and this is going to be a shorter lecture, by the way, I believe it's only like 7 slides, but before we get started, I wanted to read to you a portion of a book called Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, The Politics of Enlightenment and the American Founding, written by Darren Stoloff, and he says this. He says, "The United States of America was forged in the crucible of the Enlightenment. No other nation bears its imprint as deeply. Our ideals of liberty and equality, the ringing, self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, and the measured tones of the Constitution and the Federalist all echo the language of the Enlightenment and express its most profound convictions about the political life and natural rights of mankind. The contributions of men like Hamilton, Adams, and Thomas Jefferson to the founding and development of America and its ideals are inconceivable outside of an Enlightenment context. If we wish to understand the relevance and legacy of these founding fathers, we must come to terms with the intellectual and cultural milieu from which they arose. We must understand the Enlightenment and its politics." Now again, I'm not going to be diving too deeply into the Enlightenment. That's really for a different course. But I think it's important to at least understand sort of what it was, what it came out of, and, of course, the philosophies of John Locke. So, with that, let's dive in. Alright, so again, the film gave you some idea about what the Enlightenment was and sort of what it came out of, but I think it's important to stress this, that the Enlightenment did not develop in a vacuum. In fact, the Enlightenment was very much rooted in the development of science during the 17th and 18th centuries. There was a scientific revolution that occurred around the 17th century, and the influence of such men like Isaac Newton, who hopefully you've heard of him before. Their influence becomes incredibly significant and powerful, and that develops during this time. And while the scientific revolution in and of itself could take multiple lectures to cover. One of the things that I think we need to understand, particularly as we try to understand the Enlightenment, is that those people like Isaac Newton, who were scientifically thinking during what we now call the scientific revolution, were attempting to try and understand the world outside of a biblical context, right? Prior to the 17th century, Christendom and Christianity and what the Bible had to say did much to shape people's understanding of the natural world. Okay. During the scientific revolution, however, thinkers like Isaac Newton begin to try and understand the world from a more scientific approach, the scientific method. Not incredibly sophisticated at this moment, but it will begin to developing here. They're trying to understand, why does the world function the way it does? Okay? And basically what they're going to do is they're going to use rationalization, logic, observation to try and make sense of the world. There is this famous story, which I don't believe is true, but this famous story where Isaac Newton's sitting under a tree and an apple falls on his head, right? And so Isaac Newton postulates, why did the apple fall down as opposed to falling up, right? Isaac Newton is also credited with the 3 laws of motion, including an object in a state of motion will remain in motion unless otherwise acted upon, okay, by an outside force. Okay, hopefully you're familiar with these from your physical science courses that you took in high school. But the point that I'm trying to stress here is this, is that Isaac Newton began to look for laws of nature. He began to try and understand, why does the world work the way it does? Okay, there has to be some type of law to govern why the apple falls down instead of up. And of course, what Isaac Newton eventually came to discover, and he was right, was that there was a law of universal gravitation, that it was gravity that caused the apple to fall down, that it was gravity that caused the world and the cosmos to sort of stay in its orbit, right? And so as time goes on, these ideas about natural laws in science make their way into more of the social, economic, and political world, okay? And men like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and Montesquieu, among a host of others, largely coming out of France, but men such as these began to ask questions about politics and law. And they say things like, if there is a law of nature called gravity that governs the way the world works, the way the scientific world works, then there must be natural laws that govern politics and law. And for many of these Enlightenment thinkers, they believed that there was a natural law that governed humanity, that governed law and politics, and that natural law was reason. Okay? It says, where Isaac Newton found laws which governed the cosmos, Enlightenment thinkers wanted to find laws which would apply to government, economics, law, and politics. Okay? Now again, I would encourage you to take a course on the Enlightenment, probably from one who's more versed in Enlightenment ideologies and thinking, in order to get a much broader sense of what this movement was. But for the purposes here today, again, we're going to focus on what John Locke believed. So, let's dive in. Okay, it says, one of the foremost thinkers of this period was the English philosopher John Locke, who in 1690 published something called Essay on Human Understanding. Okay? And one of the things that John Locke is going to do in this essay is he's going to postulate about human knowledge. He's going to forward certain concepts about what he believes to be true about humanity. And so I want to read to you briefly from an old humanities philosophy text edited by a gentleman by the name of Stump, and this is what Stump says about John Locke and his essay on human understanding. Okay. He says, Locke forwarded a theory of knowledge. Locke set out, quote, to inquire into the original certainty and extent of human knowledge, right? So Locke in 1690 wants to understand, what's the origin of human knowledge? Where did they gain what they know? How do they know what they know? What's the extent of their human knowledge? How far? What are the limits of that knowledge? John Locke assumed that if he could describe what knowledge was made up of and how it was obtained, he could then determine the limits of knowledge and decide what constitutes intellectual certainty. Again, Locke is seeking in this essay on human understanding to understand not only what the limits of knowledge are, but how that knowledge is obtained. At what point do people know what they know? His conclusion was this. His conclusion was that knowledge is restricted or limited to ideas. Okay? Ideas. Knowledge is restricted or limited to ideas. But ideas that are generated by objects we experience. Okay? In other words, for John Locke, human knowledge is obtained through human experience. Your experiences in life generate ideas, and those ideas are what you know. Okay? So for John Locke, the only way to explain how you know something is to understand that people have experiences throughout their lives. Those experiences create ideas that then are turned into knowledge. Okay? The origin of ideas is experience, and experience takes two forms: sensation and reflection. Okay? Sensation and reflection. I sense something and then I reflect upon it. Without exception, then, all our ideas come to us through our senses, whereby we experience the world external to us, and through reflection upon these ideas, which is an experience internal. Okay? What Locke wanted to make quite clear was that we cannot have the experience of reflection until we have had the experience of sensation. Okay? Now, what does this mean? It means this. Each person, when they are born, has a blank mind, a blank slate. Okay, let's recall. John Locke is of the opinion that you can only obtain knowledge, which are ideas, through sensation. And sensation is through sensing things, seeing things, and then reflecting upon those things. Your experience creates ideas. Okay? Well, brand new born babies haven't experienced anything. They haven't sensed anything. And so for John Locke, all of humanity is born on an equal playing field. There is nobody at birth who is superior to anybody else, because everyone has a blank slate. Their mind is blank. They know nothing. They have nothing at birth. Okay? This is John Locke's epistemology. Okay? Why is this important? This is incredibly important because in the monarchical system that existed in Great Britain, there is this notion of a divine right of king, that by one's pure bloodline, one particular person, the king, is superior to those who are not of his same bloodline, right? And therefore, because of this divine right, because of your bloodline, you are somehow superior to other groups and therefore can have the right to be a king. John Locke rejects this idea, again claiming that all of humanity is born equal with an empty mind. This is important, okay? And it's going to indeed go right to the root of what many American colonials are going to come to see as their king, someone who is no different than they. In fact, John Locke and other thinkers of the period are going to argue that the only reason why the king has any power at all is because the people give him power. The people give him prestige. Okay, by himself, the king is not inherently better than anybody else. He is, as Locke would argue, equal because at birth his mind is blank. All right? Make sense? Hopefully. Okay, if not, please feel free to email me and ask me, and I'll be happy to continue to elaborate on this. Okay? Now, society shaped how you thought. And so, for Locke, he viewed humanity as possessing the ability to shape society in turn. And he believed that humanity was inherently good. This contradicts the teaching of the Bible, which says that because of the sin of Adam in the Garden of Eve, right, all man has what the Bible calls original sin. And that original sin means that everybody is born a sinful human being and none are good. Okay? John Locke refuted this, argued against this traditional mode of thinking, saying that no, all of humanity is inherently good. Okay, let's move on. All right, John Locke believed in a natural law, and I've mentioned this already, but his natural law that he believed in was called reason. And John Locke believed that through reason, mankind had the ability to improve his or her society. Okay, but beyond that, John Locke also believed in some very fundamental truths that the United States has subsequently adopted. For example, John Locke believed that all of humanity had the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, in the United States, we have usurped this, and we've called it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which I can talk about later why it says that. But there's also a right to property within our founding documents as well. Now, for John Locke, right to property didn't necessarily mean that if you have access to property and you can sort of claim it, it's yours. What he means by this is you have the right to property if you use it and you grow things on the property, right? For John Locke, Native Americans didn't have right to their property because the property was communal. It was a community-based property. They didn't necessarily improve the territory. Sometimes they used it, its natural resources. Sometimes they grew some things on it, but they didn't necessarily enclose it, farm it, grow things on it all the time. And it was more of a communal property. Okay, so for John Locke, they didn't necessarily have the right to property. So just be understanding of that. Okay, but he believes that humanity has certain, what we might today call inalienable rights, rights that only God can give you. That these are rights that you have by the sheer fact that you are born. Okay. He also believed, as we find in the Declaration of Independence, that the purpose of government was to protect your rights. Okay. You will find this in the Declaration of Independence in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, that the reason why the government exists is because we have natural rights. And sometimes we need a government to take some of our rights in order to protect most of our rights. Okay? All right. John Locke was also of the opinion that the government should be separated and that there should be checks and balances. And ultimately, John Locke believed that if the government failed in its chief purpose, which was the protection of the people's rights, then the people had the right to overthrow the government. Okay? And the reason why the people had the right to overthrow the government, because according to John Locke, the power of government came from the people, not from God himself. You see, in a monarchical system under something called the divine right of kings, kings claimed authority because God placed them there. John Locke argued that that's not where the power of government comes from. The power of government comes from the people, which in our Constitution we would delimit this as we the people, where the people and the government enter into what John Locke called a social contract or a social compact, wherein the people give up certain amount of rights in order for the government to be able to use that power in order to protect the majority of the people's rights. Okay. Today we would call that social contract our Constitution. Okay. Now, that's the nuts and bolts of John Locke. I'm not done talking about him, but that's sort of the nuts and bolts of some of John Locke's ideas. Let's move on. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned here is an idea that John Locke had, which he called the state of nature. And the state of nature is the natural state in which everybody lives. It's one's natural condition. Okay? And for John Locke, everybody, every human being, born equally, lived in a state of freedom. Okay? People lived in a state of liberty. Okay? In fact, if you read John Locke's book, The Two Treatises of Government, he spells this out. That Two Treatises of Government is a political philosophy that John Locke created. There are the first and second treatises. But within this second Treatises of Government, he argues that mankind lives in a state of nature And that state of nature is a state of liberty, which means you are living in a state of freedom. Now, he will go on to say that though you live in a state of freedom, it is not necessarily a state of license. So it doesn't mean that you can do whatever it is that you wish within the state of liberty, because doing whatever it is you wanted could infringe upon someone else's state of nature. So for instance, I may have the freedom to travel down the road at 150 miles an hour, but should I lose control of my car and kill somebody in the process, that's a problem, because now I have infringed, if you will, for lack of a better metaphor, on someone else's state of liberty, their state of life. Okay? Life, liberty, and property. So, yes, according to John Locke's state of nature, you live in a state of liberty, but not necessarily a state of license. It says here that the state of nature, according to Locke, has a law of nature to govern it, and that is the law of reason, which I had mentioned earlier. Locke believed that reason teaches us that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. We should not harm another one in his natural rights, and that if you do transgress someone else's natural rights, life, liberty, or possessions, then you ought to be punished. Hence the need for a type of government through a social contract, wherein the people enter into a contract with the government in order for the government to protect the natural rights of all of mankind. Okay? I hope that makes sense. If not, it's okay. I'm not necessarily going to ask you to be able to, explain exactly what all of these things mean, but I do think it's important that you understand some of the basic tenets of John Locke's thinking. In order to clarify some of this, if in fact it's not fully clear to you, I want you to click on this video here. It says click here to watch this film. It's a very short film which is going to talk briefly about John Locke and specifically how John Locke connected with the Americans and the American Revolution. So watch that and then move on to the next section. Okay, before wrapping all this up, there is another Enlightenment thinker I do think you need to be aware of, and that's because oftentimes John Locke and this thinker, whose name is Thomas Hobbes, they get put together as though they thought the same exact thing. They do not think the same exact thing. Thomas Hobbes, for instance, believed that all mankind was barbaric and evil, that they were born wicked. This, of course, contradicts John Locke, who believed that all men were born the same and of having good intentions. John Locke, or Thomas Hobbes, was of the opinion that yes, people should enter into a social contract, and John Locke also believed this, but Thomas Hobbes was of the opinion that you should, as the individual, give all of your rights to a sovereign, like a king, who would then, with absolute authority, rule over you. John Locke, of course, disagreed with this. John Locke believed that yes, you should enter into a social contract, but you only give up some of your rights to a representative government whose chief objective was to protect the rights of the people. Okay? So there are some differences between Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, even though both of them are talking about somewhat similar things. Now, if you click on the word there that says points, that's highlighted, it's going to take you to a very brief film. It's optional, but if you're interested in better understanding Locke and how he's different from Hobbes, it will provide you a brief comparison between the two men and what they believed. Okay? But it says here that Enlightenment philosophies, such as those prescribed by Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and someone we didn't talk about in any detail, Montesquieu. Montesquieu was a French philosopher who believed in checks and balances and separation of powers. Okay? All of this played an extraordinary role in shaping the way that American colonists came to think about themselves and their relationship to the government. Okay? At this point, as the British will begin to implement taxes against the colonials, and they are going to do that because of a war known as the French and Indian War. I will have a film for you to watch here. It's a short film which will cover the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. But following the war and these taxes, right, the colonials begin to understand the relationship that they have with Britain in a very different way. Okay, what John Locke is arguing, that all men are born free and equal, that all men have the right to select their government, that the right of the people is to enter into a social contract so that the government can protect their rights. And if they do not like what the government is doing, then the people have the right to overthrow the government. These types of ideologies begin to take root in the minds of many colonials. And once Britain begins to put a heavy hand down against the colonials, well, the response is going to be what you might expect. They're going to rebel. Okay? Now, the Enlightenment is an important event. Okay, and we moved through that fairly quickly. The other event I want to talk to you about, or rather there's a film, and I hope you guys don't mind all the films. It's a way to be able to cover quite a bit of information rather quickly. But the other event that we need to know about is the First Great Awakening. So what I want you to do is I want you to click on this, watch that video. This one is mandatory, so please watch that video, and then let's move on to the next and final 2 slides. Okay, so what are we to make of the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening? How do these two movements, which seem to be on polar opposite sides of the spectrum, right? With the Enlightenment, that's more of a secular type of way of thinking based upon rationalization and reason, where the First Great Awakening is a evangelical revivalist movement based upon Christian principles, right? How do these two, contradictory movements come together in a really harmonious sort of way? It says, collectively, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening encouraged the exercise of individual judgment, right? If we think back to the Puritans during this time that we've been looking at, the Puritans were of the opinion that God had already selected who was going to go to heaven and who was not going to go to heaven. Nothing you could do, according to Puritan doctrine, would change your fate, right? Well, the Great Awakening changes this type of thinking. Instead of having a predetermined fate, now one can choose which pastor they go to. Now one's agency is far more central in one's salvation, right? Same thing with the Enlightenment. I don't have to just be stuck with some monarch that I don't like. I can choose my government. I can enter into a social contract and overthrow the government should it not live up to its stated purpose, which was the protection of my rights. So the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening encouraged the exercise of individual judgment and supported the idea that people possessed the power and the ability to make personal decisions. This environment fostered a sense about America as a land where one could acquire both piety and reason. We could be both secular and religious. It goes on to state here that Enlightenment ideals cultivated a sense of rational thinking as it applied to theology, right? Many people began to look at Calvinism, which was created by John Calvin, and one of the main tenets of Calvinism is this idea of predetermination that the Puritans held on to, right? Does it seem rational that God, in his loving kindness, would condemn some to hell just because? For many people, that seemed an irrational thing. And so they reject that type of thinking. Okay? So Enlightenment ideals cultivated a sense of rational thinking as it applied to theology, while denominational splits, which happened quite a bit as a result of the Great Awakening, people had to become more tolerant of other people's interpretations of the Bible and other documents, right? These denominational splits heightened the need for Christians to be tolerant of others' interpretations. Okay? Together, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening promoted a sense of spiritual awareness, but one, in many cases, based upon reason and individuality. And so it's important to understand these particular movements because together they help us make sense of why the colonials responded to the taxes, why the colonials responded to King George III the way that they are going to do, right? We have to understand what is the mindset of these individuals. Now, again, this is a very quick overview, but I think it's important to understand where they were and what they were thinking when, in fact, Great Britain began to lay taxes down once the French and Indian War came to an end. All right, let's move on.